The fifth and final objective of this session is to examine what to evaluate, to describe what to evaluate in the performance management process. Before we get into the actual measures here, there are a number of things we can look at for what to evaluate, all right? So first we should mention that when examining what to evaluate, typically we can break this down into three areas: traits measures, behavior-based measures, and results-based measures. Traits measures typically consider evaluating employees' traits, their personality traits in particular, and these typically do not hold up well in court, especially if a discrimination complaint is made by an employee that they have been dismissed because of poor performance. So trait measures aren't typically regarded as the best, but they can be used to determine how well an employee fits with the organization's culture instead of what the employee actually does. Behavior-based measures, on the other hand, focuses on what the employee does correctly and what the employee should do differently. So things like punctuality, taking initiative, meeting deadlines, getting along with others. So the employee may engage in appropriate behaviors in that case. However, this does not mean that these behaviors actually translate into the results that the organization wants. If the employee is early, does not necessarily mean that the employee is performing well. The employee can be early, come early to work, and open a Facebook tab, and therefore not contribute much to the organization's performance. Results-based measures focuses on accomplishments or outcomes that can be measured objectively, and these definitely hold up well in courts, but can be difficult to measure and trace the employees at times. Some examples include units sold, cost reduction, efficiency, quality of production, profitability even. The only problem here is, of course, as I just said, tracing these results to the individual employee when sometimes, for instance, profitability can be outside employees' control. So I just wanted to speak briefly about that before we get into the measures, that these measures can be tailored to measure traits, behaviors, results. But in most cases, these measures are used to measure behaviors. The first measure we're going to look at is something called a graphic rating scale. Now, a graphic rating scale, as you can see in this illustration here, is actually very simple. So essentially what the rater does when using a graphic rating scale is simply, using the first example, rate an employee based on the quality of finished work using the scale on a scale of 1 to 7, from unacceptable to exceptional. Or in the fourth case, where we have a somewhat more detailed graphic rating scale, the fourth example at the very bottom of the illustration shows if we were to rate an employee on a scale of 1 to 5 according to the descriptions given here. So right away you should see that graphic rating scales are simple. They are one of the most widely used devices when evaluating employees. They can be used for evaluating traits, behaviors, and results. So they seem excellent. What then is the drawback of using graphic rating scales? Well, think about it. Even though they might be easy to design and use and so on, that in itself is a drawback. It might be too easy. So what do we mean by that? Is that the rater can have difficulty determining what is meant by certain terms in a graphic rating scale. In other words, some of these terms are open to interpretation. So let's suppose one manager might have to determine what is meant by excellent knowledge, or what is meant by unsatisfactory performance, acceptable levels of performance, and poor interpersonal skills. These things can be a bit vague, and if different managers or different raters determine these terms differently, what then is the problem we have with the scale here? We mentioned it before. Essentially what we have is that different managers will be given different ratings to the same question and interpreting the term differently. That simply means that the test is not very reliable. So the result of using a scale like this is low reliability, because one manager can have a different interpretation or judgment to another manager for the same question, simply because of the ambiguity in its simplistic design. The second example we have here is a weighted checklist. When we look at the weighted checklist, essentially we have a list of items here to evaluate an employee. In this case, we have 7 items to evaluate an employee. And the weights, of course, these aren't shown to the evaluator, but they are used to calculate the score. So the instructions for this weighted checklist simply read: check all of the qualities that are accurate assessments of the employee's performance, and the evaluator then checks which ones are relevant to that employee. All the questions, however, do not carry equal weight, hence we call it a weighted checklist. So what is most important with respect to performance in this example here is, yes, works well without direct supervision, because that carries a weight of 5.1, the heaviest weight. So that is the most important question there, but the evaluator himself would not know that. What is the least important question here? Right, engages in appropriate activity to further individual career development, because that carries a very low weight of 2.9 compared to the other questions. So the criteria here is not weighted in an arbitrary fashion, of course. It's weighted according to the importance to the organization and can be linked directly to the goals of the organization or the position itself. Okay, so this is a weighted checklist, which isn't as popular as the previous one, but can be useful. The third measure I'm going to look at here is something called behaviorally anchored rating scales, or sometimes known as bars. Here for bars, an evaluator is given specific descriptions of behaviors along a numerically rated scale. Then, the evaluator needs to select behaviors that most corresponds to the employee's performance for the time period being evaluated. So here we see that we have one scale and the employee is rated along the scale of 1 to 9. There are actually certain secondary schools in Trinidad that have begun using bars to rate their teachers and so on. So it's interesting because this is a very useful technique. And at a glance, it doesn't look as simple as a graphic rating scale. Clearly not, because each scale anchor has a detailed description accompanying it. So right away, this helps to overcome the issue from graphic rating scales, that is selectivity and bias, because of the detailed descriptions given here. Therefore, one manager or superior or rater should have a better idea of what each scale anchor point means, therefore increasing the likelihood that different raters should interpret the item the same way. Therefore, reliability should be high, right? I suppose the one drawback to using bars is that it can be difficult and time-consuming to develop. The fourth measure of evaluating performance is known as behavioral observation scale, sometimes called BOS or BOS, however you want to say it. And this determines which behavior of a bars is optimal. So if you go back to the bars, you can pull out optimal behaviors from the bars and ask for an assessment of the frequency by which the employee displays said behavior. So if you realize here, we have 4 optimal behaviors below. Is able to meet deadlines, that's an optimal behavior. Shows sensitivity when dealing with delicate personal matters, that is also an optimal behavior, and so on. Works well, showing attention. So we pull out all the best behaviors here, and then ask employees, or raters, to assess the employee according to those optimal behaviors on a scale of 1 to 5. Do they do it almost never, almost always, and so on. This is easier than other methods of assessing behavior, and it does provide feedback. It is it's higher in reliability than a graphic rating scale, not as complex as a bars. So interestingly enough, research has shown that managers and employees have said that they prefer using the BOS because of its ease of use. It provides feedback, it does maintain objectivity, and can be used to suggest specific areas for training needs. Going back to our initial point about the purposes of performance evaluation, this feeds directly into training and development. So this covers our 5th objective, which would be to examine measures of performance evaluation. And by looking at the measures of performance evaluation, I'll ask you to just consider that in the performance management process that we did earlier, because we can use these measures, particularly at the formal stage C, at the end of the performance management cycle. Overall, we examined 5 main objectives of performance management in this session, and I'll post links to any of the questions online. I hope this session was useful for you, and thank you for watching.